Hello and welcome to another marvelous video. I'm your host Will. In the Dead Space franchise, the necromorphs are a constant and terrifying presence, not because of how many there are, but because of how many variants there are. And in this video, we're gonna go over several terrifying variants of the necromorphs. Let's get to it. When I think of sci-fi horror games, Dead Space is one of the first names that pop into my head. And soon enough, all I can think of is the game's futuristic environment, themes of cult religion, and mutated undead horrors that roam freely in this world. When the game was first developed by Glen Schofield in 2008, none of us could have expected it to reach such heights of success, spawning several sequels, animated movies, novels, and even a comic series. The franchise started out in the faraway future before introducing a horror loop and all sorts of unimaginable forces of the universe, ranging from the black marker artifact that offers limitless energy but induces a sense of madness, to a twisted religion, the Church of Unitology, that worships this artifact to no end. In the present day, the Dead Space universe also continues to expose us to fascinating mutations, ranging from the iconic Slasher and Lurker to the more underrated Twitcher and Divider. Today, I will be specifically getting into all the details of these undead characters and telling you all about these mutation horrors. Number 1. The Slasher. To kick off this video, I have to talk about the necromorphs, who were essentially reanimated corpses with aggressive tendencies and a mission to attack any and all living beings in sight. Their underlying purpose was to essentially spread their infection by converting more and more human beings into corpses. But I'm sure you must be wondering why I am describing the necromorphs while talking about the slashers. Well, slashers were actually the most common form of necromorphs, and they can be best explained as the cannon fodder of their army. They were also the most human out of the necromorphs, and they retained their human arms and the ability to stand on two legs, even though their limbs were reduced to deformed and rather useless appendages. In addition to this, slashers also had gigantic arms that protruded out of their shoulders and tapered off into scythe-like endings. This is what earned them the name Slasher, as they used these arms to charge at their victims and aggressively flail around their scythes. While their arms were the most prominent features, they did have a rather small head situated between their arms, with a missing lower jaw and small red tentacles at the bottom of their heads. Even though they were vicious killers notorious for slashing away at their enemies, they could also be killed easily if an opponent dismembered their arms and left them without any defenses. Number 2. The Lurker. Just like the Slasher, the Lurker is also a type of necromorph designed with a specific purpose in mind. They were typically created out of human babies as well as infant-like organ banks. But in some cases, their formation resulted from infected dogs, such as the one on board the Sovereign Colony's armed forces and the surfaces of Tau Volantis. Lurkers were especially known for ranged attacks, and they went through an extensive number of mutations that enabled them to fight in ranged combat and low-gravity situations. Since lurkers were typically formed out of babies or dogs, their bodies typically did not have the hand-eye coordination or muscle mass to be effective predators. This is why their bodies were treated as a lump of biomass upon which the pathogen would recombine to take an offensive form as a lurker. While the general shape of its skin, limbs, and the silhouette of its head were the same even post-mutation, this structure merely provided support for the sticky tentacles that would sprout from the thoracic cavity and lower abdomen. These tentacles enabled the lurker to move around steadily and creep over ceilings, as well as walls, while retaining its swift speed. Now you can imagine a mutated baby with tentacles crawling across walls if you want a perfect picture of just how disturbing these creatures are. And if that isn't enough, they also had 3 long tentacles that produced from their backs. These tentacles would unfurl at the sight of a victim and instantaneously launch barbs with high speed and accuracy. Even though they were individually weak, lurkers had the strength to attack in stealth, especially in ranged attacks, but they could be easily defeated with the help of flamethrowers or by severing at least 2 of their tentacles. Number 3. Leaper. As the name suggests, leapers were necromorphs with a strange power to leap across long distances and corner their prey. These creatures are the stuff of my nightmares, with their razor-sharp fangs and a tail created out of the legs and intestines of their victims that they use to terrorize their next victim. To make things worse, this tail even tapered off in a scythe, and the leaper usually flailed it around to strike down their opponents as if sinking their fangs into them wasn't enough. They also had the ability to crawl across walls and ceilings, which was quite deadly when paired with their inherent power to leap across distances as well. Their bodies were formed from a single human corpse that underwent numerous modifications to enhance the necromorph's mobility, and these changes involved developing a stronger upper arm musculature, growing out their fingers into bladed claws, as well as stretching out their vertebral ridges and the spinal column to enhance movement. Their legs were also entirely transformed to the point where the muscle and the bone were flayed and fused together to form a tail that tapered off in a sharp blade. If this doesn't sound grotesque enough, the leaper's cranial and sinuses were also disarticulated from the neck, while their teeth were replaced with multi-jointed appendages that can be best described as fangs. These creatures have been present during most major necromorph outbreaks, and their strategy usually involves slowly moving towards their opponents and sneaking up on them before either biting them or striking them down with their tail. However, they could be killed with the help of force grenade, force gun, as well as by severing their arms, tails, or 2 limbs at most. Number 4. Exploder. While leapers, slashers, and lurkers were commonly found across the franchise, the exploders were designed with a specific purpose of acting as suicide bombers. They were a specialized mutation that could be best identified by the enormous grotesque-looking pustule linked to their left arm, which was filled with highly explosive chemicals. These mutants were also created from a single host whose cranium was split open in a way that its brain cavity would be filled with connective tissue that enabled the brain to turn into jaws. The left arm was also enhanced to the point where a large pustule was developed at its end, while the right arm and leg were transformed in a way that allowed the creature to maintain its balance. However, the pustule that weighed down the left arm was so heavy that the exploder could not walk straight in any way, and every single one of them moved around rather clumsily with a staggered limp. This goes to signal the importance of the pustule that could not be compromised, even if it meant that the host would have to struggle in movement, as this pustule was filled with volatile chemicals that would kill the host as well as everyone in close range. Moreover, the exploders were capable of having short bursts of speed when they spotted a victim and rushed to trigger the explosion. They typically did this by swinging their pustule at the victim or at the ground to trigger the explosion, and they usually reserved these attacks for times when they were around large groups. However, their presence was accompanied by distinctive wailing sounds that easily alerted their victims, and if that wasn't enough, their opponents could also use stasis or shoot them to slow them down. However, they could withstand a lot of damage and even survive direct hits from contact beam or other such weapons, and the best way to survive them would be by shooting them in the body to knock them backwards. Now, of course, this involved a lot of precision and careful planning, and any direct hits to the exploder's pustule would trigger an explosion that might turn deadly for everyone in the vicinity. Number 5. Brute. While the mutations I have explored so far have been created from a single host, the Brute was a large necromorph created from several human corpses. It was characterized by huge organic armor at its front and, as its name suggests, it was a brutal force of nature with extreme physical strength. Since it was formed out of many corpses, it was nearly impossible for a single opponent to defeat it, as it had multiple giant arms as well as an invulnerable natural armor protecting them. This armor was essentially a spiked exoskeleton made of bone and calcified skin, and it also had a couple of vestigial arms for situations in which its main limbs were cut off. The Brutes also had a sack-like chest, where they produced explosive material that would burst out of their bodies when their limbs were severed. Despite these heavy mechanisms, the Brute was surprisingly fast-paced for its size, and it could jump across roofs, cover large distances in no time, and even surprise its opponents by silently approaching them and catching them off guard. While all of this sounds pretty intimidating and shapes Brutes to be a character who cannot be defeated, I should point out that their backs were entirely vulnerable and devoid of any armor protection. In this way, they could be defeated if any opponent managed to target a weak point, but their speed and strength made it difficult for anyone to actually be able to get a clean hit at their back. Number 6. Divider. Moving on to the next necromorph, the Divider was a tall, thin mutation with the surprising ability to break itself into smaller creatures. Its head could also turn into a specific entity named Creeper, which had the power to take control over other corpses after its original body was divided into pieces. These creatures were first encountered on the USG Ishimura, and they typically had an appearance wherein their bodies were devoid of original organs. Their limbs were also elongated and sleek after a majority of their muscles had fallen off to give them a slender appearance. In fact, their abdomens were also exposed and were essentially a large hole in their torso, while their arms and legs had a self-awareness about them. This essentially means that its limbs could function as independent entities and move around on their own, while the head acted as the main necromorph. While the arms and legs crawled around different surfaces, the head would usually latch onto the victims or even attempt to suffocate them, while the appendages would cut off the victims' heads from their bodies before hijacking them and taking control of the victim's nervous system. If this was not enough, Divider also had a long tongue that could strangle its victims and suffocate them even from a distance, and these entities were also known for letting out disturbing loud shrieks when they were agitated. While all of this sounds pretty deadly, the Divider was infinitely weaker when it separated its head and limbs, and it could be easily destroyed with help of contact beams or flamethrowers. Number 7. Twitcher. While I have already talked about slashers, I believe this list would be incomplete without mentioning the Twitchers, aka specialized slasher variants who were created from hosts such as security or soldier personnel equipped with stasis modules. They were first introduced in the ruins of USM Valor, where they had to come into being from the bodies of the EDF Marines who had stasis modules. While they underwent a similar transformation as a regular slasher, an additional side effect was that their stasis modules could fuse with the necromorphs to reverse its effects. As a result of this, they were far quicker than any other variant, which made it nearly impossible to strike them down or even corner them. They moved so fast that it almost felt like as if you were witnessing blurs moving around, and their mutations had turned them into gray-skinned, heavily armed versions of usual slashers. In addition to this, they also suffered from constant twitching and spasms, which is what gave them their name, Twitchers. They also retained a vaguely human form, but they could be differentiated from other slashers due to their chunkier, more muscular physiques and the ability to walk and bend backwards. They often also used their slashing blades and talons to protect themselves from incoming attacks, but they rarely ever needed to do that since they were so speedy that they could dodge bullets effortlessly, even if it did trigger the twitching side effects. Number 8. Hunter. And as I come towards the end of this list, it would be blasphemous not to talk about the Hunter, who is a rather experimental variant of the necromorph. This monster came into being when the unitologist Dr. Chalice Mercer experimented on a live crew member by inserting necromorph tissue directly into their body. This soon triggered a transformation in which the crew member became a necromorph and lost almost all of his human features. In no time, his shoulder blades jutted out, elongated arms that tapered off in sharp blades, while his overall physique grew bulkier and taller. Its arms were also bound within its torso flesh, and its jaw was replaced with tentacle-like veins that dangled midair. Its toes were also swapped with claws, while one could spot different bone pieces jutting out of its flesh, and his spine and pelvic bone were also visible. The Hunter's once human voice was also replaced with a throaty roar, and it has gained the newfound ability to regenerate limbs and heal injuries at supernatural speeds. While it could be defeated if the opponent dismembered its leg or hit it with stasis while it was in mid-regeneration, it was rather difficult to overpower a Hunter, and one had to move strategically and use everything in one's environment to dismember its limbs and hit it with stasis before it had a chance to strike back. Number 9. The Tormentor. Notoriously known as one of the most visually horrifying necromorph out there, the tormentor is a gigantic mutation whose body is entirely formed out of corpses. It had a slender body with multiple elongated limbs, a misshapen mass of hardened fragmented bones, and a flexible neck. Moreover, its upper jaw could also extend into a fanged maw, and a couple of mandibles that grew out from either side of its face. While it was a rather menacing mutation, Isaac somehow managed to defeat it by aiming directly at the yellow tissue near its shoulder joint, which then served as a frame of reference for all other players to target its weakness. However, it was not so easy to trick the tormentor and easily shoot at its joint, and in most cases, it fed on its victims or smashed them to bits before they even realized that they are in fatal danger. Number 10. Tripod. Appearing in the form of an amalgamation of human corpses, the tripod is a three-legged necromorph that was mostly encountered by Isaac Clarke. While all necromorphs have a reputation for being deadly and aggressive, tripods took this violence on a whole new level and would attack their opponents by swinging around their arms, slamming their fists into the ground, and eventually using their blade-like tongue to pounce at their victims and claim their lives. If this was not disturbing enough, a female tripod's body consisted of an infant's body growing out of a tentacle in addition to the combination of human corpses. Even while raising this infant, the female tripod had pounced on Isaac, dragged him across the floor, and eventually attempted to stab him with her bladed tongue, which truly outlines their aggressiveness and heightened bloodlust. This mutation is undeniably one of the most lethal necromorphs out there, but even the most mighty of all have their own weaknesses, and these variants were particularly vulnerable to flamethrower attacks or direct hits to their tongues. Number 11. The Nexus Organism. Before I wrap things up, it would be a crime to miss out on mentioning the Nexus Organisms, aka the hive minds that could receive and broadcast signals sent from the markers to the Brethren Moons to all other variants of the necromorphs. In this way, this particular variant was dedicated to sending telepathic messages to all other necromorphs, and they were also notoriously gigantic as compared to the rest. This mutation usually kicked off their life cycle as slasher-sized variants that eventually grew taller and even had giant antenna-like appendages protruding from their backs. It is hypothesized that these appendages help them broadcast the marker signal, share commands with other necromorphs, and coordinate large-scale outbreaks. They achieve this with the help of the synapses of the nerve clusters that could send and receive bioelectric signals, and the mere thought of them transmitting these signals through their spiky, spooky appendages is enough to send a shiver down my spine. Ugh. And on that note, I've explored some of the top most terrifying mutations in the Dead Space universe, ranging from Hunter and Twitcher to Brute. As the franchise continues, I cannot wait to see how these monsters stir up more trouble in the franchise. And in the meantime, I would love to hear your favorites among them in the comments down below. See ya!